Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Spain didn't lose the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was an important moment not only for the US but also for Spain. This war shaped the future of the two nations. The US was able to expand on the Pacific and to free former colonies, while Spain showed that it could not keep up as a great power. Spain experienced a massive decline over the time and started to lose its status of a great power, while the US increased its status as a great power. Most of the war was a naval war, and while the US didn't have a great navy at the time, it was at least a modern navy, while the Spanish navy was just in a very bad shape. Spain was not able to keep the Dominican Republic under control and had troubles with a territory that small. Cuba and Puerto Rico were just overseas possessions, and then there were also the Philippines, Guam, and many other islands in the Pacific, and that's what was left of the once great Spanish Empire, with some smaller possessions in Africa like Western Sahara or Equatorial Guinea. It won't be possible for Spain to totally beat the US, but Spain had chances to somehow not lose the Spanish-American War. So what if all of that changed? What if Spain didn't lose the Spanish-American War? Spain had a large chance of keeping Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba had 200,000 Spanish soldiers on the islands. However, in OTL these soldiers were ordered to retreat. So let's imagine that the Spanish never asked their soldiers to retreat, and the soldiers would stay in there, in Cuba, making it very difficult, if not impossible, for the US to invade Cuba. The US-American Navy was stronger than the Spanish one, and it is still possible for the US to take the Philippines and Guam. But let's just say that the Spanish fleet, which wasn't totally destroyed in OTL after the fight in the Philippines, would re-engage in a fight with the US and somehow surprise them and win or manage to tie with the US Navy. Spain would not venture on US-American soil, and it would keep its soldiers on their islands. Spain would need to fight in a defensive way. They would also need to send more troops in order to secure their possessions, and I don't think that Latin American countries would join the US in the fight against Spain, or that suddenly Spain would find other allies, because there was just no need for other allies to fight against the US. And moreover, Latin America also had their own share of problems, so they wouldn't just go to fight Spain again. After keeping Cuba and defending Puerto Rico and defending the Philippines, the US and Spain would come together on a table and conclude a peace treaty. Technically, Spain would have been very lucky, but for how long could Spain be that lucky? Spain was not stable, and only if Spain suddenly would change a lot of laws and guarantee autonomy to Cuba and Puerto Rico, only then they might have a slim chance of keeping these territories for a longer period of time. But let's just say they would do it. As for Guam and the Carolina Islands and Mariana Islands, those would stay in the hands of Spain, and I don't think that Spain would have problems holding these islands for a longer time. The Philippines, I'm not so sure about the Philippines. The US would be totally embarrassed, and a lot of the history would change. The US would certainly not become expansionist, and their entire political scene would change. Noteworthy presidents like Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson would never become elected in such a timeline. Instead, the US would choose a period of isolationism, true isolationism. Yes, they would still intervene sometimes on the American continent, but they would not go and pick fights against American territories that belong to other powers, such as Spain, for instance, or Britain or France. Spain would still have problems after getting a white peace with the US. Their problems would not just magically disappear. The Cubans would still want independence, then there were the Philippines and Puerto Rico. For the next years, Spain would still use force to keep the empire together. But over the time, many politicians would advocate for a different approach. Cuba could in the next decades get autonomy, Puerto Rico as well. The Philippines may perhaps see immigration of Spaniards or Spanish loyalists. It may be split up in different smaller provinces, and the independence movement wouldn't get support from other countries, so there could be a way or a wide range of possibilities of still keeping the Philippines for some time. During an alternate World War One, Spain would be neutral, but the Central Powers they would still be victorious. The US wouldn't intervene in the war because the whole politics of the US it would be just so different. And the US, and especially the public of the US, would be against wars with European powers. And worse, wars on European soil. After World War One, Spain would not experience the same problems as it did in OTL. The Spanish mentality would be different. Spain may actually benefit from a German victory and make trade deals with Germany, and even get Gibraltar back if Germany would have made a lot of pressure. And Spain would not be that defeatist, but actually try to make things work better in the empire. While France and the UK they would decline, Spain would actually be able to keep a very respective level. Yes, sure, they would never reach the same level as, let's say, the OTL British Empire, but come on, if Portugal was able to keep large parts of Africa under their control for centuries and decades, Spain too could keep the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Pacific Islands for a longer time, especially if they would suddenly now get good relations with the German Empire, for instance. The Philippines would become culturally much more Hispanic, and Spanish may at the end even become the dominant language in there, like French is a dominant language in many African countries. Spanish would be used as administrative language and lingua franca between the different and various communities that exist on the Philippines. It would also be somewhat closer to Latin America than to East Asia or Southeast Asia, at least from a cultural point of view. We would also perhaps see some Cubans in there, or Puerto Ricans, or maybe other Latins who, due to the shared language, would find a job in there or make businesses. Eventually, at some point, the Philippines, they would get their independence, but as a culturally more Hispanic country. It would be some mixture of an Asian Hispanic country, something that the Philippines in OTL never became. But if it stayed for much longer time in Spanish hands, this would have been a very big possibility. The Pacific Islands may too get their independence or actually just stay Spanish, just like, let's say, New Caledonia is still French. Cuba would at some point get their independence, and probably a bit sooner than the Philippines. Same with Puerto Rico, but the independence wouldn't be that violent, and they would have good relations with Spain and probably some trade deals. Let's just say that maybe the independence would be somewhat similar as what happened with the colonies of the UK. Spain would probably try to do something similar as the UK, maybe some type of Commonwealth or some type of trade deals. But it's also entirely possible that they would not have anything of that, and that there would just be some trade deals and good relations. The US would at one point recover and have ambitions, but the white peace with Spain would have been a huge blow. Everybody at that time wanted a victory against Spain, but if there was no victory, the public would not only be disappointed, but probably be against any type of war, and worse, a war on the European continent. Iconic presidents such as Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson would have never become president of the US, and thus a lot of the US politics would have just been butterflied away. But also Spanish politics would be butterflied away, and if Spain could negotiate with their colonies and grant them also some freedom over the time, it would have never seen the Spanish Civil War. The problems with the Basque and the Catalans would have been smaller in comparison with OTL, because there would have never been a suppression against them, as it happened during the time of Franco. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.